Sustainable Change Alliance Foundation conversation, which features Seth Levy and Philip B. Taub from Nixon Peabody to discuss the current landscape for startup investment. My name is Sherylle Mills Englander. I am a board member of the SCA Foundation and the director of UC Santa Barbara's Office of Technology and Industry Alliances. The Sustainable Change Alliance Foundation is an impact-oriented, member-based, not-for-profit educational group. We are focused on impact investing, which we define as bringing financial and other resources to double and triple the bottom line of organizations that are trying to address big social, environmental, or health-related issues, and trying to do that in a sustainable manner. I'd like to acknowledge the hardworking and dedicated SCA board members who are participating in today's call and who make these SCA discussions possible. I would also like to express our gratitude for our sponsors, who we could not do this without. Our founding sponsor is Argyle Capital Partners, Maps.com, and UBS. Our platinum sponsor is Nixon Peabody Law Firm. Our gold sponsor is JP Morgan Chase. And our silver sponsor is Brashears Insurance. If you're not a member of Sustainable Change Alliance Foundation, we encourage you or your organization to join us on this journey. Please visit sustainablechangealliance.org where you can sign up as a member. And before we get started, just a few logistics. First, this meeting is being recorded. All participants are on mute except for our guest speakers and myself. And if you have any questions for our guests, we encourage you to ask them, and please use the chat room feature in order to enter your question in. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce our two speakers from Nixon Peabody. First is Seth Levy. He is a partner at Nixon Peabody and co-chairs its life sciences practice. He works out of the firm's Los Angeles office and represents a variety of startups and emerging growth companies in the life sciences and other industry sectors, both in California and around the country. Phil Taub is a partner of Nixon Peabody and leads its private equity practice. He works out of the firm's Manchester, New Hampshire and Boston offices and brings a national perspective of the investment and deal climate. Seth and Phil, welcome to the SCA discussions, and thank you so very much for taking the time to join us. First, why don't I invite you to give a little introduction to yourselves, maybe starting with Seth and moving to Phil.
Sure. Well, thank you, Sherylle and Linda and Jonathan and Stephen and everyone who's gotten us involved. It's been great to attend a lot of these sessions for the last number of months. I'm happy to be on this side of the microphone, but so we'll see how this goes. For those who don't know me, my background is in biological engineering. I've spent the last 20 or so years working primarily with healthcare institutions, academic institutions, and the companies that tend to grow out of that space. Oftentimes it's startup and emerging growth types, or the companies that are doing research or technology development on campus or in connection with some of those kinds of organizations. In that regard, I'm often serve as the outside general counsel or IP counsel for these companies. In the early days, obviously having our eye on investment and different fundraising opportunities is always key. So it's been an interesting few months, certainly from that perspective. So that's maybe me in a nutshell. And Phil, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself. That would be great.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Sherylle, thanks for inviting me and Seth to join here. As Sherylle said, I am based in the Northeast. I live in Southern New Hampshire, work out of our Boston office. It's been an interesting time working from home. New Hampshire is not a bad place to be, just being a more rural area, very pretty area, to ride out the COVID pandemic that we're all going through right now. But I have a lot of clients on the West Coast. I have a lot of family that live between San Diego, Los Angeles, Santa Barbara as well, up by the Mission. And so very fond of the Santa Barbara area. For those of you wondering why I don't live on the West Coast, my wife is from the East Coast and she wanted just enough separation between her and my family. So that's why we're on the East Coast. But we do love the West Coast. Haven't been out there in a while. My parents are down in Irvine. So looking forward to getting on an airplane soon and be able to get back out to the West Coast. I'll tell you a quick anecdote. I actually grew up in Southern Africa. and came to the United States originally to go to university. I started on the East Coast at Boston University. I'd never seen snow before, so I was 18 years old, never seen snow before, and toughed out some miserable winters in the Boston area. And my younger siblings, who were younger than me and mostly grew up on the West Coast, ended up going to UC Santa Barbara. And if you could have seen the look on my face the first time I went to Isla Vista and saw UCSB and realized that there were universities like that when I was suffering the winter on the East Coast, I was pretty upset. But in any event, I wish I'd gone to UCSB. I do represent lots of investors. Sometimes they are family offices, wealthy families, venture funds, and private equity funds as well. I even represent some big Fortune 500 strategics that do acquisitions as well. And sometimes we're on the other side where we're the target or the seller, but we see a tremendous amount of deal flow in all different parts of the market, in all parts of the country, and in all various industries and sectors. And since this pandemic began in the middle of March, I've been hosting a weekly webinar trying to get some of the smartest people around the country to just get on our webinar, tell us every week what's going on. So I feel like we have a pretty good handle from many different voices, and I hope today, Sherylle, over the course of our hour here, to be able to share with you and all the folks on this webinar some of the insights that we've gotten and some of the predictions that we've been hearing about what's coming next.
Sounds great. And also, I need to do a little housekeeping update. I am very sorry to say I forgot to thank our newest sponsor, Impact Family Office. So thank you very much for your support, and I am so sorry you're off the original script. But for now, to get started, I'd like to ask Bill if you could share what you're seeing from a national perspective. Has the current situation accelerated any existing trends? And sort of how have things changed in terms of different types of investors and what they may be thinking in the current landscape?
All right, well, I'll try not to use up the whole hour to answer that question. I'll try to do that in a few minutes because there's a lot going on, right? So some of it's pretty obvious. We just start with the digital trends, right? There were quite a lot of digital trends coming into this pandemic that have now been accelerated. So, I'll give you an obvious example, the adoption of telemedicine. I don't know if anybody on here has had their first telemedicine appointment, but it's obviously a lot more efficient, and there's a lot you can do, over that. And in talking to doctors and hospitals, we've seen a massive increase in the amount of telemedicine. Obviously, like what we're doing today, a networking event on a Zoom call, that's been accelerated. There's, I would say, like in our law firm, Seth, for example, most of the lawyers in our firm had never done a Zoom call, had never been on a WebEx. Right now, it's sort of become routine. We've even figured out how to put virtual screens in behind us, right? If I can figure that out, almost anybody can. And, take remote learning for our students, right? There are some universities, like in my neck of the woods, Southern New Hampshire University has 130,000 students online. It did before COVID broke, and there's only a few leading edge universities that have that kind of enrollment online, and everything has now changed, right? As vast amounts of the country have now had their children learn remotely, right? And so that has lots of consequences, right? An obvious one is the adoption of 5G. There are a lot of issues adopting 5G, and 6G is coming as well. And we're going to see an acceleration in both of those areas, right? Residential real estate. If you didn't have a home office before, or you didn't have a gym in your house, you've probably thought about, already started to install that. We've seen a massive increase, in construction there. Good luck finding, gym equipment right now. I was looking the other day, still 6 months to 1 year wait to get barbells and basic stuff, as you've seen massive increase in demand there. I, occasionally would jump on the Peloton. I noticed that in the beginning of COVID, 150,000 people getting on a class. Like, this is definitely a new dynamic, right? Commercial real estate, the flight out of the offices in the cities, right, to the home is, obviously having a profound effect on commercial real estate. There are a lot of offices, including a number of ours in Los Angeles, Chicago, New York City, Boston, that are sitting empty right now. And we're all trying to figure out like how to get back to the office. And, you know, what I think we expect to see in the beginning, we thought everybody would shrink their offices because a lot of businesses have figured out how to work from home. And thinking about sort of the future here, what the conventional wisdom is right now is that in fact, the offices are not going to shrink. Probably what's going to happen is there are going to be less people working in the same size offices, but each person, because of social distancing and all the new procedures we're going to put in place, is going to need more space to work in, right? So it's interesting in the effect that that's going to have on commercial real estate, right? We also expect to see a growth in remote offices or co-working trends. You know, some of the biggest companies right before the pandemic were really struggling. Some of them were obviously in the news and so forth. But we expect this idea of these small remote offices, these co-working offices, to accelerate as people will still need a conference room or still need to have a place where they can congregate and so forth, right? And then, of course, the restaurants around those businesses in Boston and New York and Los Angeles. A lot of them have had to close. A lot of states obviously closed their restaurants. Some are closing them again, the restaurants and bars. And so you see the travel industry, the hospitality industry, the restaurants really suffering. And then on the other side, the supermarkets, of course, have had record months and record quarters. And you know, the places that could figure out how to deliver food, deliver your supermarkets, you don't have to go to the supermarket, are obviously doing very well. And that's a trend, you know, that's probably here to stay. Folks that had never, you know, called the supermarket or logged in and asked them to deliver have gotten used to that, you know, and so we expect that's a trend that's going to stay. And then, you know, so many people are working full time and now have their children at home who've been you know, learning remotely. And so, you know, unfortunately, I mean, I'm fortunate my kids are a little bit older and more self-sufficient, but you know, folks are having to be a full-time teacher as well as keep a full-time job, which has been really hard. But we do see students now starting to sort of reevaluate the brand, the value, the cost of the education that they're getting, whether that's in private schools or in universities and colleges. We're seeing a lot more students moving to skill-based learning now, you know, with enrollment in vocational programs dramatically on the rise right now.
So,
You know,
so if I could just, in the interest of time.
I'm sorry, I could go on forever. So
yeah,
go ahead,
no. This is very interesting. But also, I'm curious. So those are some really important trends to keep in mind. And then, how are the investors' attitudes or perspectives changing? Are you seeing a jump to get into these more hot areas? Are you seeing a reluctance to the due diligence? Are you seeing certain types of investors getting more active or less active? What's that state look like right now?
Yeah, so I'll try to sum that up for you. So the valuations were very high, right, coming into this pandemic. I think just about anybody that is an investor has probably complained that since 2008, the valuations have just continued to rise and rise and rise. And I know I've had a lot of conversations about what would change the valuations. You know, a lot of things felt overvalued, right? And so we have seen valuations plummet in most areas, and generally they have plummeted. There are a few industries and a few sectors that are obviously doing better than others. I think, you know, it's really the tale of the winners and the losers. We're going to see a rise in distressed deals, Sherylle, but not in every area, right? And in some areas, you know, like the telemedicines, the digital, anything digital right now is doing well. You know, life sciences is doing well. So this is an area Seth knows very well. They've been able to hold their valuations, but you know, some of the you know, food manufacturers, you know, that are in sort of the right space are doing well. But generally, everybody else, things are bad. And, you know, are deals coming back? Yes, slowly. You know, family offices have been in really good shape. A lot of family offices were smart enough to be liquid, have cash. We've seen amongst our clients and family offices being opportunistic right now. They are playing a role, family offices doing direct investing. and filling a gap where maybe companies can't get funding from banks right now because banks are reluctant to lend. Family offices are amongst the area that have sort of stepped into that.
Right.
Venture funds. In the pandemic, the VCs moved to shore up their existing older investments. Now we're finally seeing them focusing on their earlier stage investments. Similar trend with private equity funds. The private equity funds and the VC funds did not get any PPP money, right? And so the private equity funds went to shore up some of their portfolio companies. They all have pretty much, not all, I should say most of them have access to a lot of capital, record years of fundraising. There's still a lot of dry powder out there, but we are seeing private equity funds now coming back into the market, starting to do deals. The real story is the public companies. If you have a look at what's happened here since March amongst the public companies, we've had record amounts of shares being sold. I saw something like 60 billion in shares were sold in May of 2020. That's a new monthly record ever in the history of our country, right? High yield debt offerings, 1.07 trillion or something like that for the first half of the year. That's more than double what they did last year. So the public companies have had access to the capital markets, the debt markets, and the capital markets have raised a ton of money. And I think the net of that is that you're going to see the big public companies go to work doing M&A deals.
And Seth, thank you, Phil. That was very helpful national perspective. And now I'm going to ask Seth to go a little, I guess it's not really micro to talk about California, we're rather large, but are you seeing similar trends within California? Are you seeing something different? What's it like at our state?
Yeah, I think it's certainly similar trends. I guess, a couple of things. At least let's maybe start with the life sciences sector. That tends to be where I spend most of my time. And happily right now, even though the reasons aren't great, right? We certainly wish this wasn't what was driving the opportunity, but we find that so many companies have so much opportunity that it presents some really practical, fundamental questions, particularly for those companies that are developing drugs and devices that have a longer trajectory to begin with. What do you do when there's such an opportunity to pivot now, right? Where you've built your investment expectations, you've built the entire strategy for your company around a particular framework, and suddenly this other opportunity comes up.
And by that other opportunity, you mean applications on COVID, which allows much quicker return?
Yeah, it's COVID, it's vaccines, it's therapeutics, it's manufacturing PPE, it's creating new diagnostic tests and better diagnostic tests that we need. It's the whole area of telemedicine that Phil was talking about, and using data sets or other platforms to sort of move into this space. The interesting thing is, for a lot of early stage companies in that environment, it's hard to get your name out, right? It's hard to gain any real notoriety and the fundraising and other benefits that come with it. And so part of the opportunity around COVID isn't even, cracking the code on having the vaccine or having the drug, but being able to prove the concept of your technology, your platform, to show that it works in this space, even if it only preliminarily works. Because if it does, that could be sort of a surrogate for something that's very exciting about the technology that might get more strategic investors, like the big pharmas that we're looking at you, more excited, or some of the others that are in that space. So a lot of what we're trying to figure out now with an eye on investment is, do you make that pivot? Do you expand in that area? And what does that look like? How do you deal with your existing programs or business, particularly for companies, for example, that have ongoing clinical trials that they're trying to manage when suddenly they can't do patient follow-up visits or whatever. And the huge risk that comes with making any sort of public statement that isn't entirely accurate here, because unlike before, when you were usually talking to a discrete universe of very sophisticated pharma types, let's say, now everybody's listening. And a mere reference to some positive result about your vaccine trial, let's say, can have all kinds of effects with your shareholders or other stakeholders that may not entirely understand or whatever. So we're
And
seeing a lot of that. No, go ahead, Cheryl. Sorry.
okay, no, that's very helpful. And I have a question that actually is topical before I move on to my next one, and that is, I think a lot of us have seen the FDA do some loosening of regulations when it comes to COVID, for example, sort of immunity for clinical trials and things like that. Are you seeing any change in approach to regulatory approvals outside of COVID in the life sciences? I mean, could this be a trend where the FDA gets a little easier to work with?
Well, hope springs eternal, right? But and I know this is being recorded, so I'll have to edit that one out later. No, but it's true, right? I think what's playing out is this: that FDA definitely has put some different regulations or relaxed some regulations, as you'd expect, because of the urgency of the problem, right? So there are opportunities to accelerate some of the research that's going on, to make available some products for other reasons without going through the normal course. I think the hope is that will have some ancillary benefits throughout the organization as we learn what does it really require to ensure that something is safe and effective, or what does it really require in terms of documentation. The regulatory process is not an easy one, but sort of like from the perspective of a company, if you can prove that, I mean, look, if we can get a vaccine from start to finish in the kinds of timelines people are talking about or anywhere close to it, that will absolutely inform the vaccine approval process in the next go around, right?
Right, so potential hope is there. And so maybe, thank you, Seth. So maybe broadening out from life sectors, again, I know in preparing for this discussion, one thing I got a lot of questions about is the deal mechanics from both this company and the investor perspective, whether that's due diligence, where it's harder to visit companies, and actually what's happening with the term sheets. Maybe Phil and Seth, maybe you can talk a little bit about what you're seeing. I know the deals are starting to come back in again, Phil, but how are the term sheets, the due diligence, the actual mechanic side of the shop changing, or is it the same?
Seth, I'm happy to go first if you want. Or
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
well, the good news is the term sheets are coming back, which is good to see. The valuations, as I mentioned before, in most sectors are down. But there are some obstacles here. The diligence, Sherylle, that you mentioned is a big one, right? How do you do diligence, if you haven't met in person? Certainly the lawyers can do a lot of it remotely, the accountants can do a fair amount of it. But it's going to take creativity, honestly, and that comfort level between a financial sponsor or family office investor, et cetera, with that management team that you're backing. When you used to be able to get together, and there's only so much you can really do on a Zoom call, right? At the end of the day, it's not exactly the same as being together. We are seeing deals close. We actually closed a deal last week where they never, in fact, got together, but they got comfortable with that. But I think we'll see things like, instead of getting large groups together, maybe the buyer group will just send one or two people, and they'll be very careful, and they'll take the tour and they'll meet with the management. Everybody else might be then on a Zoom call with two of the people there, for example. We see some of that stuff happening. It'll be interesting to see 3-4 months from now how creative investors got on the diligence side. One big change I will tell you is that it had sort of become the norm for a seller to go out and get a quality of earnings report. Go out, hire a Big Four accounting firm or the Grant Thorntons or RSMs of the world, and go and get a quality of earnings and pay for that themselves before they went to market. Over the last 2 years, I don't think we saw any deals without the seller getting their own Q of E. All of a sudden, that's dropped off dramatically. We've sort of gone back to buyers will get their own Q of E if they want one. It's interesting just to see things sort of change between buyers and sellers, in these various points. But what was very much a seller's market, is starting to tip a little bit towards the buyer's side.
So I'm going to do something off script now. So you're both very intelligent men. I want to task you each with a side of the table, and I'm going to ask Still, if you are a family office or an angel or a VC, what are some thoughts about how they might approach, you know, the process of sort of preparing to have a discussion about investing? And Seth, the flip side of it, and maybe you should go first if not putting you on the spot, is a startup who's just starting to think about fundraising in this climate. What should they be thinking about differently given where we are as they're preparing for the inevitable fundraising rounds?
Right.
So Seth, maybe you could start with the startup perspective.
Yeah, no, happy to. I mean, I think so. A couple of things. I mean, for one of the great challenges that any startup or early stage company has is, getting connected with the right potential investors, right? And so we have a lot of these networking events and other other opportunities to try to put people together. That's one of the great challenges right now, right? That a lot of these events and other organizations, either events are canceled, the organizations don't exist, and so there's been a lot of, I think, good work going on to try to figure out how do you make those contacts happen in a universe where the normal course may not work. So assuming you can get over that hurdle, I think the way to prepare is really twofold. One is that things really haven't changed, right? A good company is a good company and needs to have its act together and needs to have a plan and needs to have a solid team and technology and whatever it is that the business is about. I don't think that's any different now than it was 6 months ago. I think to Phil's point, we've got to be a little more realistic about our valuations than perhaps we were before. But the guts of what we're looking for hasn't changed. The other piece, though, that's important is that the world has changed, and particularly for companies, and I think any company falls in this category, everyone's got to deal with COVID in some fashion, either because it's directly related to the products or services that you're developing, or it relates to your workforce, or your supply chain, or your, some of the contingencies around being able to actually succeed in what you're planning to do. And so I think there needs to be a thoughtful, solid plan, or probably plans in place, because nobody's got a crystal ball right now that really answers any of these questions. And so, we're working with a lot of different companies in different industry sectors where there's, there are a lot of surprises probably still to come. But, I think if you don't have a full plan around some of those things and an ability to answer those questions, then I'm not sure you're really ready for investment anyway.
So maybe part of your business plan is actually addressing COVID as it relates to you and your business and how you're going to address it. Yeah. And Phil, putting a finer point on the question, so, for the smaller family offices, the smaller angels, finding opportunities and saying, how do you have any advice for them as they're trying to navigate this landscape and find good, solid opportunities?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, some of the fundamentals are always going to be the same, to Seth's point, right? It's always about the people involved, the management team, the people driving the business. The opportunity has to make sense. Some strategies are you make your money on the buy, and there's going to be an opportunity. If you have the appetite for distressed deals, you're going to have that opportunity to make money on the buy, right, as opposed to the sell. And so if that's something you're comfortable with, I would not, necessarily recommend, if you've not done distressed investing, if that's not something you're comfortable with, you probably should stay away from it. Stick to the more sort of true and tried investments and look at that specific opportunity. Where it does get hard is what Seth's talking about, this COVID effect. When you go back and look at the numbers from the last quarter or two, and try to understand how COVID affected the performance of that business, and then try to extrapolate what that's going to look like in the future, that's really tough, right? I think some other sort of, lessons that have been learned the hard way is make sure the business is overcapitalized, not undercapitalized, And so you probably want to put in more money, than you normally would in investment to make sure that company does not come up short. And there's some very practical problems too, to be honest. These smaller companies that got PPP loans and got access to them, this is this crazy thing. The government put out all this money before they put out the rules, right? And the rules are still coming out, and we're still learning the rules. It really is an unbelievable dynamic. And so one of the things we're realizing is that, if a company took a PPP loan and now they take an investment, especially if the investment is now a change of control, they may no longer be eligible for forgiveness, right? And so that is definitely an impediment right now in getting deals done. Is us the portal finally opened last week for forgiveness, and it's taken a while to get these loans forgiven. But right off the bat, that's a gating item, is to try to understand how much money did they take and how does that, affect the deal. So as you start to drill down in all these layers, and then the other thing we're realizing is nobody has a crystal ball. In the Northeast where I am, we were hit very hard in New York and New Jersey and in Boston. And things seem to have stabilized, and you're seeing in California and the southern states, things are on the rise. We're probably another year of COVID, if you think about it, right? We'll talk a little bit more about the vaccine and so forth, but whenever the vaccine comes out, they're not going to have it available to the whole country, in 1 month, right? So we're probably all looking at another winter, especially winter up north, northeast, Midwest, of COVID again, which is going to be fairly devastating.
Okay. And now you brought up the CARES Act, the PPP program. Has that, from your and Seth's experience, how has that impacted things? Has it been sort of a net positive for investors to see, or have these complications we've talked about, maybe made investors shy away? I mean, how has those two programs actually affected deal flow? Maybe, Seth, I see you nodding a lot, so if you have something to jump in on?
Yeah, I mean, I wish it was something more positive, but I know one of the things I'm sure people heard a lot of was how challenging it was to get some of this money or to figure out the process and all of that. So for the true startups and emerging growth types, it's been, at least in my experience, a real mixed bag of who's had access to this funding and who hasn't, and the degree to which they really understand it, right? I mean, these are, as Phil says, the rules are still coming out. This is not entirely uncomplicated money. You really need to understand what you're doing and how that impacts your workforce. And so, to me, it's been a challenging that way. So I think with an eye toward investment, this is a new universe of diligence types of issues and things that are going to need to be cleaned up or accounted for. Not unlike some of the liability and exposure that these companies have taken on because they've breached agreements that they can't perform anymore. We're spending a lot of time on, is there force majeure here? Was this contract really performable in the first instance? Does anybody have any real leverage to try to deal with a dispute? And so there's a lot of that in the background, particularly, I think, for the earlier stage companies that, may not have planned for some of these things, or even worse, didn't have insurance to cover some of the losses. So I'd sort of characterize it as a cleanup / really getting the house in order as best one can, and then being prepared to be transparent about it in the course of any negotiation, because these are not things you can easily sweep under the rug. And I think if there's any sort of bright spot to some of it right now, I think there's a lot of sympathy for people who didn't necessarily get it right. I mean, everybody's struggling to try to keep the trains running. And so if you miss the mark a bit, I don't think you're going to be judged for it, but you do need to manage it.
Sure. Yeah, sure. If I could add to that, there was a serious mismatch between the expectations of businesses and what the politicians who put the PPP in place, were looking to do, right? And just think about what happened, right? They put a bunch of money out there, billions of dollars, and they ran out of money initially, right? And so they had to go back and top it up again. And in the meantime, the politicians and the press sort of got a hold of the list of names of companies getting money, right? And then big companies were getting shamed on national television and in the newspaper. And for us, for our clients, we rushed in to help them get money, and then some of them had to give it back. And then they topped it up again a second time. And do you know that there's still money available under the PPP? They did not run out of money again because so many people got shamed into not taking the money that there is still money available under the PPP program, which tells you pretty much everything you need to know about how that program did. On the bright side of things, 25% of it, and then ultimately more, was allowed to be used for real estate. So the commercial real estate market right now has sort of been artificially propped up because on one hand, the lenders have been giving forbearance agreements, and on the other hand, PPP money has been cycling through to take care of the landlords. That's all coming. So that was good for a while, right? But this COVID has lasted longer than the program. And so those chickens are going to come back to roost right now. We're going to see a lot of defaults on the commercial real estate side. And then on the employment side, a lot of states and the federal government added benefits to employees. And so companies took PPP money expecting to use it to pay for employees, but then had trouble getting their employees to come off unemployment because they were literally earning more money staying home, being unemployed, than if they came back to work, right? And so you had all of these problems working through it, compounding with what we've talked about before, with the rules aren't fully articulated, and in some cases, folks are going to have to pay this money back when really they wouldn't have taken it if they thought they had to pay it back.
That's very interesting. Yeah. Yeah, and just a quick reminder to the audience, we have about 20 minutes left. And if you do have a question, we really encourage you to submit them through the chat feature, so don't be shy. And I'll switch gears just a little bit. I know we talked a little bit about the market sectors that have been going strong, but as far as emerging growth and startups, have there been any surprises about sectors that maybe have done a little better than you expected, or sectors that you're surprised maybe have fared a little worse? And Seth, you look enthusiastic, so I'll go to you and then Phil.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how much any of this qualifies as an industry sector because, to some degree, each company is a little bit different. The one that was most recently, I guess, it surprised to me is actually in the pet adoption space, right? Which I think is just a good example of sort of the laws of unintended consequences. Suddenly, business is booming for all these sad reasons, right? Suddenly, people can't take care of the pets. The shelters aren't open in the ways that they were, and you just sort of think about all of the ripple effects that these kinds of things have. So, great for their business, as it were, but not for reasons that animal lovers who are trying to basically operate a shelter were hoping for.
Although I noticed that New York actually had a little bit of a positive in that they ran out of dogs and cats because everyone wanted to adopt them, New York City, right, for a brief period.
Yep.
But,
yep. So, I know, Phil, you have some other more specific examples.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I have 3 very poorly behaved English Springer Spaniels. So if anyone couldn't get a pet and wants to adopt one, you're welcome to take one of my Springers. So, I'll note a couple things. Cybersecurity, which may be obvious to some, but I think has not gotten enough attention. Businesses obviously spend a lot of money, putting up firewalls and protecting them. And we know that a lot of our big businesses are getting hit all the time by foreign governments and other folks, trying to hack into their information. But those firewalls don't exist in our homes. And so I think we're going to see a seismic shift in cybersecurity as more people are working from home. We know a lot of companies struggled with, even just hardware issues, software issues with having a remote workforce. And we're starting to see companies pop up. For example, we have a client called Minim, which is MINIM, minim.com, that popped up in this pandemic to provide, basically a modem that you attach to your Wi-Fi that creates a similar network than you're used to having in your office, with all the firewalls and so forth. So that I think is an interesting trend. Another one we don't think a lot about is insurance. If you haven't figured it out already, your insurance rates are going up big time, and you're going to see that over the next 18 months. All insurance rates are going up, right? The insurance companies are dealing with increased risk. They have an increased number of claims, and they're of course declining investment returns. And so that is another sort of byproduct of all of this and what we're seeing here, So it's very interesting to think about all these things, but there are definitely a number of things that are not going back to the way that they were before.
Yeah, at least to me, borrowing for the Seth's metaphor, the rippling effect in COVID and how far-reaching it's gotten into every aspect of every business and part of your personal life is truly profound. So Seth, switching a little bit, I know that you do a lot of intellectual property and patent work, and I do see some participants that in particular have tech companies where, you know, patents and IP and everything are important. How are you seeing the USPTO and the Trademark Copyright offices in this? Are they still being responsive? Are they overwhelmed? Or what can we expect as we try to keep our assets well protected?
Yeah, well, so a couple things. I mean, you know, there are a lot of things in government that changed as a result of COVID, you know, court closures. So, you know, all the sorts of things that are causing, you know, there's no trials going on, or we're trying to do depositions by Zoom. So a lot of things have closed down or been delayed. The patent process hasn't had that happen, right? And all the deadlines in the patent process are statutory and can't be relaxed that way. So one thing that hasn't changed a whole lot is the patent process itself. Now, you know, whether people are still filing and have budget for that and all of that, that's another animal, but the actual process hasn't changed. The office, I think, has been about on the same pace as it's been before. You know, a lot of the examiners are already working from home, believe it or not, sort of a little known secret. They're not all there in Virginia. I mean, and so, you know, I've over the last few years started getting used to getting phone calls at 3 o'clock in the morning from patent examiners because that's just when they were working. And so that really hasn't changed. So I think the speed of things has remained about the same. There are some exceptions now for COVID-related technologies, you know, some ability to speed up the patent process. So there's a little of that, but you know, most of the mechanisms for doing that weren't a whole lot different than the mechanisms that were available to speed up the process anyway. I mean, the short version of that is if you want the patent process to go faster in the US, you can throw money at the patent office through one of several programs and you can cut the line. So that's more or less what this looks like too.
And then a question that's come in that I think is perfect for both of you, as Phil is sitting in the Boston area with all its well-respected universities, and then California competes quite well with Boston when it comes to universities. For university, as we all know, I mean, the university's research got essentially shut down throughout the country. And even now, UCSB is hoping to ramp up, but performing at 10 to 15% of our full research capacity. University research is historically one of the main drivers in the United States of new technology companies coming out. So do you have any sort of ideas on whether and how the university shutdown might actually affect startup investment and opportunities?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've got a few issues here, right? I mean, so first, you know, so many of the early stage technology, life sciences, other companies in the country have their roots in academia, right? That really remains the main export from the United States is intellectual property, right? It's in the form of oftentimes, you know, great science and research that goes on in academia, finding its way into a company and moving its way out into the world. So yes, any shutdowns or slowness or enrollment decreases or lack of research funding, any of those things are only going to have, at least in my view, a negative effect or a shrinking effect on research output, right, which can find its way into these companies. The other issue is that once companies are out there in the world doing their thing, many of them still stay very closely related to the university, right? They do sponsored research there, they use the university's equipment. It turns out they don't have a particle accelerator in their garage, so they need to collaborate with an academic institution to do that. Or in the life sciences space, a hospital that may not be able to do the sorts of clinical trials and research right now when they're focused on more emergent needs. And so there's a lot of that right now that's creating a bit of a sticky wicket for these companies to navigate through. And so the question becomes, where do you find either the new technology, if it's going to be somewhat limited coming out of the academic space, and how do you support the ongoing development of your technology if you're even partially reliant on an academic partnership right now? So that is a very practical challenge for a lot of these companies. I think that depending on how long this goes on, there are sort of a few things that are going to happen. I mean, I think, necessity being the mother of invention, I think this is a period of time where we're going to see new things happening anyway, even if COVID went away tomorrow, right? So shared laboratory spaces, incubator programs, all those sorts of things that were kind of out there already. I think this is more of an acceleration of a trend than something entirely new. But it does create an urgency for it that didn't quite exist before, so that you could actually have the ecosystem that's needed for these companies to move forward. But we'll see. I sort of look at it the same way as distance learning. I mean, for this group, the very same technology we're using for this call, 8th graders are using to learn math, right? And so when you think about sort of how nascent the technology and the opportunities are, but how quickly we can imagine it changing over the next 6 months, I think that's going to be sort of a hallmark of the sort of academic company relationships too.
Yeah, and I just want to do a big shout out to our UCSB startups who are participating in this call, who have had to face limited access to the incubators, limited collaborations with UCSB, and we really appreciate you hanging in there because I know a lot of you have been affected. Switching gears, actually, we got an interesting question that I'm going to direct towards Phil, although Seth, feel free to jump in as well. So we were asked, what actual fundraising stages are you seeing the biggest changes in now? I mean, are you seeing more of a change in seed and Series A? Is it the 1 to 5 million, 10 to 30 million? I mean, are there any stages that are being particularly skewed or affected by the current situation?
Yeah, and this is what I was talking about before, which is that early on in the pandemic, if you think about in sort of April, May, there were very few, early rounds and seed rounds of funding. So it was a lot of venture funds going back, doing later rounds just to shore up the finances of their companies, especially since most of them couldn't get access to PPP loans. It's only now that we're starting to see the early stage rounds come back again. And they are coming back, and there's more players in it, including the family offices, starting to play a bigger role. I think generally we're seeing a lot more minority investments generally, not just in the venture space, but in the private equity space as well. And that was not a trend, that was there before. But there's a lot of money sitting out there on the sidelines, looking to go to work, trying to figure out, should we be in distress? Should we pick, something in the life sciences? Should we just stick to our knitting and what we know? And so, there's a lot of hand-wringing going on out there, trying to figure out, where to put the money. But again, there's a lot of money sitting out there. The fundraising effort that, when the year started, was at a new record high, right, for venture funds and private equity funds. And those deals all still closed. All the fundraising deals that we were working on for funds still closed in April, in May, in June, right? They were basically unaffected by COVID. And so that money is now sitting there waiting to go to work.
Great. Well, that's some good news.
Yeah, I hope so.
Now, final sort of questions from the audience, and then I'll ask you our wrap-up question. And I think it's a really interesting one because to a certain extent, what we're hearing is there's a certain amount of same old, and then a certain amount of flexibility and pivoting. Are there any alternative business structures that might be good for a startup or an emerging growth to consider in light of this? For example, like a public benefit corporation or things that might provide a more flexibility. I mean, the answer might be no, but I think it's a fascinating question to ask. So Seth and Phil, what do you think? Seth?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I don't know that I would view this as having changed much in sort of a COVID environment, right? Unless the nature of the business itself has changed, right? So I think, I'm a substance over form kind of guy, right? So I think if the business was one where it made sense to be a B Corp or to have some kind of sidecar nonprofit or to do something creative because of the market it's trying to serve, then sure. But I'll tell you, I mean, we've had exactly this conversation with a number of clients, frankly, who were trying to figure out, should we do things through a nonprofit because we're trying to address COVID? But as with any issue in the world you're trying to address, the fact that it would make the world a much better place is not necessarily reason enough to change your corporate structure, right? We have to think about what are we actually trying to accomplish what are we trying to do from a fundraising perspective? Where's the money going to go? If you're fortunate enough to have a successful company and make a lot of money, you are always welcome to donate it. And there are plenty of good places to do that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that your business needs to be structured that way. But Phil, I don't know if you're seeing anything different or.
Yeah, no, that's a good answer. That's a very good answer, Seth, to that question. The only trend we've really seen in this period of time is the rise in the number of SPACs. Again, because the capital markets came back really strong, right? The stock market, there is access through the capital markets to equity and so forth. So we've seen a dramatic rise in the number of SPACs. Now, they've only got 2 years once you form a SPAC, right, to actually deploy that capital and find an acquisition. And they tend to be on the larger side, than sort of your smaller investment. But beyond that, everybody is sticking to, true and tried entities, looking for limited liability, and so forth. And so I don't think now is the time to stray too far from what's worked for many decades.
All right. So my last question, and we had to start a teeny bit late, so I'll give you each 3 minutes. What are your predictions for this second half of the year? I know we're all dying to know. Phil.
Well, I don't know if anybody knows, but there's a big election in November. I don't know if anybody's heard about that. So to me, that's probably the single biggest thing, right? Whatever your politics are, I think the conventional wisdom was pre-COVID that Trump had a very strong chance of getting reelected. Now that's significantly diminished, with the devastation to the economy, et cetera. And so, maybe the administration's last hope is a vaccine. If they can get a vaccine out there that works before the election, that may be enough. Certainly, a vaccine is going to help the stock market, which is already, doing much better. But the scary part about all of this, besides the unknowns and so forth, is that the federal government used its entire playbook, right? They've been printing money, they've been guaranteeing, all the sort of corporate debt and so forth that's out there, and quietly behind the scenes pushing the levers, which is why everything seems to be okay right now. Pre-crisis, the majority of the outstanding debt in our country was at the household level, right? There'd been a massive deleveraging since 2008, that liquidity crisis. Now, today, because of all this federal stimulus, right, the majority of the debt exists at the government level. And that's pretty scary because that probably means a weak dollar, rising interest rates, and I'm going to say that scary word, inflation. We maybe not in the next 6 months or in the next year, but it's hard to imagine a scenario in which we don't have rising inflation over the next 3, 4, 5 years. And we're going to beat this COVID thing. The Spanish flu was way more devastating, and we got through that, and we're going to get through this, but it's going to leave its toll, for a long time.
Thank you. Yeah, it's hard to have a silver lining in today's climate, I hate to say. Seth, the final thought?
I'll see if I can find the silver lining. I mean, as a guy who tends to be in the innovation space, it's moments like this that create innovation, right? I mean, if you look at what happened in the economic downturn 10, 11, 12 years ago, some of the most impactful technologies and companies that exist today had their roots at that time. And so I think we're going to see remarkable, new technologies and, across industry sectors. I think we're going to see a change in where people live. I think you're going to see moving from the urban centers to other places, the distance learning and distance working are going to change a lot of things. And so all of the different companies and businesses that will thrive through that change, I think can present a lot of opportunity from the investment perspective and otherwise, right? So I'm going to remain.
And I will say, as a community that has plenty of open space, like Santa Barbara, it is a wonderful place to have to weather a pandemic compared to my colleagues in Boston and New York and Philadelphia who have not left their house and backyard in 2 months. So that's a good silver lining. I just want to say my deepest thanks, both Phil and Seth, to both of you. I think your insights, both on the national and state level, are just so important for us to understand, and you did a phenomenal job. So thank you very much. And I want to thank everyone who participated. Great questions, and I thoroughly enjoyed my discussion. So everyone have an absolute wonderful day, and tune in to our next SCA discussion, which will be announced soon. Thank you, Seth and Phil.
Thank you so much.